and welcome to episode 16 of the Instruction Booklet. I'm Jeremy, your host, and I'm joined always by Michael, who, if you're in his class, I don't know if you can get in it anymore, but this episode might help you out. What's going on, Michael?
What's going on, Jeremy? He's making reference to the fact that for me at Rice University, classes actually just started for the fall 2024 semester. And I have the privilege this semester of actually teaching a first-year writing composition course on video game studies as a topic for helping students, do their composition assignments. So it's very cool. The class seems great so far. Today I asked everybody to go around the room and say their favorite video games, and the answers were only mildly disappointing. As they tend to be. Yeah, there was some. I was hoping for some. Actually, one kid said The Outer Wilds, which was really cool.
That's a good game.
I explained Disco Elysium to them, and they all were staring at me like I had two heads.
Yeah.
Because most of the answers were along the lines of, League of Legends, Genshin Impact, Valorant, which is understandable. I enjoy the occasional competitive MOBA / multiplayer hero shooter or whatever is popular right now.
Yeah. Okay. Well. On this episode, we also have something special. We have our first guest. It's kind of hilarious. We've mentioned him a few times in the show. We've also poked fun at him a few times in the show. And he's actually the person who introduced me to Michael. So that's been kind of nice. And so he is a post-PhD, right? Is that what you said? Student.
PhD candidate.
PhD candidate. In Irish Lit. This is our friend Adam Pickens. Adam, how's it going?
I'm doing all right. Yeah, things are fine.
I mean, you almost sound like it's the dog in the room with everything on fire.
This is fine. Yeah, I mean that's kind of life at the moment, but yeah, keep going.
Yeah. So I guess as a introduction for you as a guest, what would be what is things that you do for your PhD, as well as what's some of your just general gaming experience?
So as far as my actual sort of research goes, I study Irish Lit mostly from the 20th century. I do a lot of work with theater, but my actual dissertation I'm working on has to do with radio drama in the 20th century. A lot of sort of media theory and stuff like that, which kind of overlaps a tiny bit with Michael's work in games. So occasionally we trade some notes on that sort of stuff. I have the fun distinction of being able to, when people ask me about this, point out that other than one county in Pennsylvania, Ireland was broadcasting commercial radio before anybody else on the planet, which most people did not know. But as far as games go, I've been playing games many years. I mostly didn't have consoles growing up, but we had a PC. So I played a lot of games on PC growing up, a lot of real-time strategy games, turn-based strategy games. As the PCs got more powerful, I started to branch into more of those sorts of things. And then once I did eventually sort of get consoles, I went back and devoured a bunch of older games and that sort of stuff. I tend not to play your popular online multiplayer games. I tend to find other humans on the internet related to games to be not fun to enjoy gaming with, but talking about them is fun. So I play a lot of single player games. Single player games.
Sweet. Well,
Adam is famously a big fan of Blood Bowl 2.
That game is great, but it will make you hate your friends.
Adam, actually, it's he can't stop playing. It's become a problem. We've had to have multiple interventions.
I mean, I am a former champion.
Yeah, that is true.
That's true. All three of us are actually for our league.
First league champion right here. I mean, that was part of how we all prior to that, we played a tabletop version of Edge of the Empire. That's how I met Michael. Yeah. And then we started playing Blood Bowl. So, as our episodes tend to begin, and because Adam, you're our guest, what have you been playing, reading, watching, entertainment stuff have you been doing lately?
Let's see here.
I know you're a big Final Fantasy 14 person, so
yeah, we had the new expansion for that dropped about a month ago, so I've been doing that and just leveling crafters because I'm a goddamn degenerate. so I'm doing that a lot. I've been meaning to go back and finish Shadow of the Erd Tree. I haven't done that yet. I played about half of it, I think. Yeah, I have the hard part left. I kind of want to start through a second run through Baldur's Gate 3, because unlike Michael, I'm the weirdo who built one character and played them the whole way through instead of building 7 characters.
Yeah, I finished the game too. So
yeah. But that's what I've been playing recently. Other than reading stuff from my research, I did pick up a novel recently. I haven't started it yet, but I'm kind of really interested because I've heard really good things, called Cloud Cuckoo Land by a guy named Anthony Doerr. It's nesting stories spanning multiple centuries that include fake novels written by Diogenes. It's got real good reviews and things, so I'm kind of super interested to dig into that at some point.
That sounds cool. Okay. Michael, what about you? What you been playing, reading, watching, etc.?
Well, my go-to time waster these days has been Hearthstone Battlegrounds, which is the auto battler mode on Hearthstone, which is as addicting as it is infuriating. But a new season came out, and so I've been enjoying the way it's shaken up the meta, even if the new meta is by all accounts significantly less balanced than the previous one, and it's getting boring already. But other than that, I mean, you and I played a little bit of the 2XKO alpha that just happened a couple of weeks ago. For those of you listening at home who may not know, the developer is for League of Legends, or Riot Games, who have also made Valorant, Legends of Runeterra, and a couple of other things, are working on a fighting game from the League of Legends universe. So it's got League characters. It's a 2v2 fighting game. I thought the game itself was really solid in terms of its bones, but it does need a lot of work as far as balance and some fine tuning.
Yes.
Is that the worst name for a video game you've ever heard?
2XKO? Oh, it's awful.
I liked Project L way better.
Yeah, Project L was better.
It's the Elon Musk naming his kids of video games.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
That's true. That is true. But yeah, so I mean, I was playing that recently. I've actually, past couple of days, I've been trying Deadlock, which is this new hero shooter MOBA hybrid that Valve has been working on in secret. And it's cool because it's got some of the lead devs of Dota, I believe, who are now working on it. It's cool. It the vibes are kind of like Smite with aesthetic elements of BioShock Infinite, which is very interesting. It's like a third-person shooter, combined with a MOBA.
Interesting.
And then, other than that, I've been meaning to start playing Stardew Valley again, just because I need something to actually de-stress myself, because all of the video games I've been playing lately have been stressing me out. On top of, getting ready for the semester and everything like that.
Right.
And I have been watching Euphoria. It's taken me a while to actually sit down and decide to watch it, but I'm really enjoying it. So,
sweet.
What about you?
Let's see. So yeah, I got to play the 2XKO alpha. I only got to play it for a handful of days, but yeah, my opinions were, oh wow, this is a versus game. And let's see, I started playing. I'm doing a seamless co-op Elden Ring run with another friend of mine. That's been hilarious. Co-op Elden. The mod does the most ridiculous things. At one point in time, Shane mounted up on Torrent, and Torrent didn't show up on my screen, so he's just hovering in the air. But it's been kind of fun, just playing co-op Souls games is just a whole different experience. It's so much fun. I love it. Me and Adam did DS3 and
some memories of that DS3 run through.
Yeah, some of my favorite memories. I'm currently reading Masters of Doom in preparation for our next episode. So I've been learning about John Carmack and John Romero and the early days of id Software. It's been kind of interesting reading about the late 70s, basically Wild West of computer PC development. and finding out like random fun facts, like they sold the original Apple One for $666.66.
What year was that?
70 was it, early 80, like I had to look it up. I can't remember. I also picked up this really cool book. I think I sent a picture of it to you, Michael. It's called Search and Destroy. It's really neat. It's a remake of a manga from 1978.
Dear God.
And they updated it. And it's like the original story was like about a samurai who has like 48 parts of his body stolen by 48 demons, and he's trying to get all of his body parts back. And in this adaptation, it's like cyberpunk, where it's like this person as a child had all of their body parts stolen, so they're like completely like cybernetic, but they're trying to get all their body parts back from all these like mobsters and like crazy people who live in this like cyberpunk future kind of place. The artwork is gorgeous. The story is very interesting, so I will definitely be reading more of it.
Apparently, if you adjust that for inflation, that's like $4,000.
Fair. In terms of watching, Finch the Bear, watching the new season of Futurama, watching Red Cat Ramen has been hilarious. It's an anime about a restaurant run by cats. That's about it. So yeah. Looking forward. I was thinking about the other day that there wasn't very many games that I was like looking forward to right now, other than like I'm ready for like the Marvel version. I've seen a lot of stuff about it. I made the sad decision the other day to uninstall Helldivers 2. Like that game just disappointed me. So
it was the hot thing for like a month.
Yeah. I've also been
out of it.
I've also been playing a shitload of Balatro, so yeah. All right. Well, so the episode today is kind of fun. It's one of our normal off episodes, but we're still kind of using it as like a way to talk about some of the era stuff that we're in. But today we're talking about narrative in game. Hence why we have a guest. So the episode's kind of be broken down into a couple of parts, and we'll sort of, make our way through it, but we'll be talking about like what it is narrative in the video games, the early days of narrative, tabletop's influence. We'll be talking about the 80s and 90s and like MUDs, CRPGs, text-based adventures, point and clicks, JRPGs. We'll also be talking about like JRPGs versus Western RPGs. We'll be talking about like the 2000s, and then we'll end the episode talking about like kind of where things are today and where things are going. So I guess to kind of kick things off, we have to kind of define narrative, which, as I said in our notes yesterday, I have a feeling we're going to define narrative, and then Michael's going to blow it up out of the water. Or Adam.
I'm prepared.
One of you two. I'm out of my league. But I have like some little blurbs here from a Power of Narratives. It was written by the University of Europe Applied Sciences for their like one of their video game courses. And it says, the narrative signifies storytelling and is a core component of a video game along with other visual aspects. It is a chain of events in the game that defines how the game moves forward. Narrative designers come up with a story structure, including the theme, plot, and dialogues, if any, and the emotional elements that connect the audience in the story. The importance of a narrative in video game lies in its ability to provide players with a sense of purpose, motivation, immersion in the game world. A well-crafted narrative can enhance the player's engagement with the game, making them more invested in the outcome of the story and more connected with the characters and settings. So, I would say, like, for like a starter, that seems like a pretty good like baseline. Would y'all agree?
I think functionally that's fine.
Yeah,
it's fine, but I would want them to define their terms more.
Oh yeah.
Like, what is is there a functional difference between narrative and storytelling? And what do they mean by those things exactly?
That's fair. I guess I don't know. I would have to think about like what that difference would be.
What does that difference mean to you, Adam?
Well, I guess my whole point is like you can have narrative that isn't necessarily telling a story, but storytelling is a form of narrative, kind of an apples and oranges squares and rectangles sort of thing. And when it says sort of narrative signifies storytelling as its core component, that kind of makes sense, but they haven't really like said what they mean exactly by those two things. So that's me picking apart their kind of definitions. So like, is storytelling or narrative just a matter of cause and effect? Like, if you can create a logical chain of cause and effect while playing a game, is that narrative?
I'm not sure.
Just sort of like,
I
kind of
will
example.
say
Go ahead.
with regard to that distinction, a lot of the academic scholarship that I've looked at with regard, like interactive fiction and electronic fiction in like the late 90s, early 2000s, it seems to me like they're using narrative and storytelling interchangeably. Which is to say, Eric Zimmerman, in a 2004 essay, Narrative Interactivity Playing Games, actually coins a concept that he calls game stories. And game stories are characterized by their status as both a narrative and a game. Hence, I think his use of the word game stories rather than game narratives as something that is both a game and a narrative, to me, seemingly implies that, at least as far as games are concerned, a lot of people want to say that stories and narratives are the same thing. That's not to flatten over the distinction that you've made, so much as to perhaps highlight the fact that in game studies, there is kind of a lack of reckoning sometimes with the finer, points of something like literary criticism.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to like nail down is there a meaningful reason to distinguish between like what I'm calling narrative and what I'm calling story? And to give kind of examples for that, let's go to kind of classic examples. I would say that in like the Mario Brothers games, it's bare bones, but it is a story of a character, Mario, who is trying to save a kidnapped princess from Bowser. And you go through and you get to the end and she's not there. You got to go to the next place to try and find her. And it's the story of how he kind of eventually does save the princess and defeat the bad guy, right? So I'd say that's storytelling. Whereas in Space Invaders, like, there's no real set dressing, but clearly you are somebody manning a weapon trying to defend the planet from space invaders. I'm not sure if I'd call that a story, but I would maybe call that narrative.
Interesting.
So I guess we would define story as more like the overall setting versus narrative being you as a person controlling the thing to guide a more like, would be like the narrative would be like more like the player character.
Narrative is something that could be created by the player, whereas story is something that's intentionally created by the game designers.
Okay.
Maybe. But then this brings up sticky questions, like when does it cross from being narrative into story? When you introduce setting, when you introduce characters, that sort of thing. Is narrative just the cause and effect of a player interacting with a game world? I mean, at the end of the day, like, we can tell, you could say like Pong, it doesn't have any narrative, doesn't have any storytelling. It's just the game of tennis simulated in a game. But like, when people describe tennis matches in real life, they say, well, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and they tell a story.
Right? Yeah.
So not to jump the gun, because I know I had this later in the notes, but the distinction actually that you're drawing here is similar to what I mentioned yesterday, that some game scholars have sort of nitpicked as the difference between being a narrative versus having narrativity. Being a narrative, it sounds to me like game scholars, I could actually read very briefly something that I have written here. Just, for the sake of being as clear to our audience as possible. A further helpful nuance that we might observe is Marie-Laurie Ryan's distinction between being a narrative and possessing narrativity. The property of being a narrative, Ryan writes, can be predicated on any semiotic object produced with the intent of evoking a narrative script in the mind of an audience. Versus having narrativity, on the other hand, means being able to evoke such a script. So similar to your example with tennis, the tennis match, we would say, is not a narrative, but it has narrativity in the sense that it can evoke a story in the minds of the viewers who can then go on to recount it as if it's some kind of dramatic, narrative to somebody after the fact. So, playing around in sort of an open freestyle way in something like Tears of the Kingdom, where you, build a plane and crash it into a bokoblin camp or something. That's not necessarily a narrative, even though Tears of the Kingdom does have a narrative, but that has narrativity in the sense that you can create your own story.
Yeah, I mean, I like that distinction a lot. I have a thing, because I was banging around this idea in my head the other day. I'm wondering, can we say it's storytelling and no longer narrative, or I guess in this case we'd be saying it possesses narrativity as opposed to just being a narrative. When the sort of, how do I put this? So games are about feedback, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Like you as a player do a thing and the game does something back, and the feedback is sort of what keeps you doing things.
Algorithms.
Yeah. Well, I guess I wonder if the distinction becomes when the feedback you are getting, the reward you are getting is not mechanical, but maybe emotive.
Yeah. I can see where that would, how something makes you feel based on what it's doing.
Like your reward for poking at it, if it's truly storytelling is something that is emotional as opposed to mechanical. And obviously a lot of games, particularly as you get more and more modern, are doing both at the same time. But are you willing to play a game just to see what happens next in the narrative, not because they're giving your character more levels or more power or any of that? Will you play something just for the story? If so, it very clearly is storytelling in that sort of sense.
I agree. And I have an interesting example, or an interesting way, I guess, direction to take this discussion. However, I do want to let Jeremy, maybe set the stage in terms of where he was going to take, because I know you have notes, Jeremy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I guess for some the examples, the next part of the thing that I pulled off from the University of Europe of Applied Sciences was talking about the narrative can also provide frameworks for gameplay mechanics, creating meaningful experience for players. For example, in the game like The Last of Us, the story of Joel and Ellie's journey across the post-apocalyptic landscape provides a sense of urgency and purpose to the player's actions, driving them to overcome obstacles and defeat enemies to achieve their goals. Furthermore, storytelling in games has the potential to explore complex themes and issues in other ways that media cannot. Video games allow players to experience and emphasize with different perspectives and viewpoints, creating a more immersive and impactful experience. For example, the game Life is Strange deals with themes of friendship, loss, and time travel in a way that encourages players to reflect on their own experiences and decisions. I think that kind of lends to what you're saying, where it's now granted, the truth being, I've not played The Last of Us or Life is Strange. I have seen lots of this, but there are games that I have played where it's these parts of the game will lead you to other places, but sometimes the narrative evoking that to make you want to feel like you need to go that way. A great example would be one of the games that I was playing, I was briefly streaming for this, I was playing a lot of Transistor again. That game, I absolutely love the story of that game, and I will play that game for the story every time because that game fucking stabs me in the heart by the end of the game.
Yeah.
So,
I do find that quote kind of interesting. Particularly, video games allow players to experience and empathize with different perspectives and viewpoints, creating a more immersive and impactful experience. And I think they do that, but I'm not sure I would agree if somebody wanted to say that their interactive nature makes them inherently better at that than more traditional storytelling mediums.
Yeah, I think it's more a broad topic. I think video games is more and we'll get to this a little later, of being one of the many facets of the pieces of entertainment. It's kind of how at the beginning of the episode I asked what forms of entertainment are you ingesting right now? It's because it's not I know other things outside of video games exist that can invoke or inspire and stuff like that. I mean, I am a traditional artist and also designer, so thinking about visual stuff and invoking things is also kind of in the same
somebody who studies more traditional narrative forms, like one of the things that both fascinates and frustrates me, as somebody who also likes video games, is people want to talk about writing in video games, but like, how in the hell do you write something where you have no ability or very little ability to like force the person consuming it to move on to the next plot point?
Mm-hmm. I think
like you have no control over pacing in a lot of ways.
Right. I think as we go through the episode, because we're gonna like kind of travel through time a little bit, we'll see how that like changes and like how different formats of games will change and provide us with those. I have this last little like quote here from an article called "Narratives in Video Games." This is like a really long article by Gerald Farka. I have the PDF, but I liked this little quote that said, "Not every game genre is dependent on story," and it made me think about like your subject of like Pong. So it's like Pong does not have a story.
It's not dependent on story, but I do think it has some kind of narrative element.
Makes me laugh because I think about like what Michael was saying the other day about like it when we were talking about notes about like Tetris. I can't remember like the actual quote you were using, but it was like someone like really digging into Tetris.
Yeah, and Catherine Hales and Hamlet on the holodeck, and her. I think I don't think it's controversial to say that it is a infamous reading at this point, which is not to say that I even disagree with it, but and Catherine Hales, and this is a paraphrase, described Tetris as perfectly encapsulating the life of the like working class American, having to constantly deal with things piling up, trying to make everything fit, and ultimately being overwhelmed when we can't, deal with everything that's sort of being put on our plate at the same time.
Right.
There is a little bit of a back and forth between Catherine Hales and Marcus Scalanen, who's another, game studies scholar who fancies himself a bit of a ludologist, which is a fancy word for somebody who studies games primarily as games. And these kind of scholars are more interested in arguing that games are first and foremost systems of rules for which something like narrative is aesthetic and contingent, like completely unnecessary for the game. Which is to say, in many cases, the story doesn't matter for some games.
Yeah.
And I think a funny example that I was going to mention is actually a game that is technically very rich in lore, and that's League of Legends. I think this is a very funny example because I played League for a long time, from around about season 2. If anybody is at home listening who is familiar with League, Draven was the newest character when I started playing. And League of Legends, despite being an incredibly successful game, has had its lore retconned so many times. I mean, there are characters in the game that have not had stable lore for more than a year or so before it gets changed again. I think Warwick had his story changed like 3 times. Mordekaiser had his story changed like 3 times. Ultimately, that didn't prevent anybody from playing and enjoying the game and playing these characters and enjoying these characters. Because in this case, it actually is kind of just the system of rules that people enjoyed at first. Now, of course, these, League characters have gone on to develop iconic status in such a way that now some people do actually just enjoy the aesthetics of these characters, but that's kind of my example.
I'm reminded of, have either of you ever dug into the plot of Destiny?
No.
All I know is that the moon's haunted.
I mean, moon's haunted, yeah. But like,
shotgun.
Yeah,
it's such a weird game to me. Even though I played a lot of Destiny and Destiny 2. I'm not always happy about the fact that I did, but I did. But the way that game's like communicates its story is frankly baffling to me, because it's got this whole developed world with characters you meet and talk to, and like you go places and there's somebody on comms telling you why you're there and what's going on and why you have to shoot the giant bug monster, and why this bug monster is different from the other bug monster you've killed. But like, if you actually wanted to follow the plot of Destiny, you have to like go online and dig into this like massive, like, they like offloaded like 80% of the story of that game into an offline like database. You have to go like read that they just don't tell you in the game.
What you
It's
mean?
amazing.
You mean they
Wild.
don't have like a Vodividia YouTube channel?
I mean, there are people who do that, I think.
Yeah.
But like, you know, if you're playing Dark Souls, you're going to occasionally be like, I could read this item description that's right in front of me as I'm playing the game, where it's like, there are major parts of Destiny's plot where it's like, if you didn't go to the thing and read the card system over here, you don't know like why this person is here and doing this thing at all.
Wow.
It's crazy.
Bungie, you should know better.
Well, Bungie is not Bungie of old.
But that is very true. So, okay. So I guess, do we have anything else we want to add onto our defining, I guess, narrative before we move on? I know, Michael, you had one little note, but like I think you kind of touched on it anyway.
Yeah. Remind me to double back onto the topic of ludonarrative dissonance, because I have some thoughts about that, but we can save them at the end of it.
The big L word that people get mad about.
The big L word, yeah.
Okay. Adam, do you have anything else you would like to add on like terms of like definition?
We can move on. I could do that for ages, but we should move on.
Okay, so the next little segment I have is from the History of Video Game Narrative by Mike Butler, and it was talking about like some of the early day stuff. And granted, we've already kind of touched upon it, but I think this is kind of helpful in terms of like where we're going. But the quote is, these ancestral staples of home entertainment didn't worry about justifying themselves. Pong was virtual tennis for two players. Space Invaders consisted of a tank firing at slowly descending rows of ships. Perhaps the novelty of controlling something on a screen allowed one to overlook the existential crisis lurking in these games, which I found that part really hilarious. Even as this at this time, though, games had yet to enter the public sphere toyed with narratives. In a time when graphics wouldn't allow for realistic or even recognizable depictions of settings and character, narrative could shape one's imagination when playing the game. Even then, stories were often simple and direct, with most of the tension coming from challenges in gameplay rather than compelling plot developments. This trend would continue for many games throughout the game history, including major franchises such as Super Mario and Castlevania. So, that's kind of like how when we were talking about like the early days of games in some of our previous episodes, your literal display is just like, small block on big screen. Like think about how when we were playing Rogue, there was a story in Rogue, but for the most part playing the game, you're just a square block moving around a maze that gets pre-generated trying to find a scepter or something. And even then, like you think about like no one's going to say Birdie the Brain, that was a machine in like the late 60s, early 70s, had a story. It was a machine that literally played tic-tac-toe. So there's this interesting like jump here in my brain where we talk about like, thinking about like toys for games as entertainment, with toys jumping into the games medium as like a visual display of like stuff that's going on the screen.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I clearly have some disagreements with him making statements about Pong and Space Invaders not like having any narrative at all. But I think the biggest thing this highlights is the idea that like the early problem wasn't we haven't thought to put narrative in games as much as like there was the game and then there was the narrative and they were kind of separate. Mm-hmm. Like you pointed out with Rogue, like there's a story, but when you're playing the game, the story is kind of over there. And what we've kind of gotten better at over time is intertwining the things.
Yeah. Michael, you got anything you want to add?
No, not at this particular.
So yeah, I think technological limitations are probably going to be like kind of what we're saying is, you probably got an instruction booklet that had like 2 paragraphs worth of like story, and then you got the game. It kind of reminds me of like we're talking about like Space Invaders and stuff like that. The side of the cabinet of Space Invaders, if you've ever seen it before, has like this big giant like black monster with like a red outline, and it's just completely nowhere near any of the graphical stuff that's seen in Let's see if I can find it real quick. Space Invaders cabinet. And it was always like hilarious to me that there's like nothing like that monster in the actual game. I'll see. Is that gonna drop that? Yeah.
I will say that does make me think.
Here, I'll drop that.
I know we've talked about
in your chat there.
We've talked about like graphical fidelity in the past, and I've kind of made this argument that one of the benefits actually of having more limited graphical representation is that you're still technically farther from the uncanny valley than you are from the more photorealistic, or rather the attempts at more photorealistic graphics from like, I don't know, the 2000s and the 2010s.
Yeah.
And so there's a way in which oftentimes the player's brain can do more work to fill in the gaps and the absences in such a way that can actually make minimalistic graphics sometimes more visually appealing than more detailed attempted photorealistic graphics.
Yeah, so kind of like
the benefit,
like a less is more kind of thing.
Right. And I think what's interesting about these like examples like Space Invaders and you know, not necessarily Destiny, because Destiny has good graphics, but like these decisions to have graphical representations or a narrative outside of the game itself in such a way that goes outside of the game's very limited graphical representation is that you're almost giving the player an image in their mind of what they should be seeing when they're just looking at 8-bit pixels on a screen, such that they have a frame of reference. And now they look at Space Invaders, and in their brain, they see the spaceships, even though what they're looking at is just pixels, if that makes sense. So I think it's an interesting way of circumventing that problem.
I mean, a few things. The first of which being, like, in a way, what you're talking about is sort of the graphics as signifiers instead of actual things, which brings up interesting kind of questions for the language of games, I think. But the other thing is, if we're talking purely like games are trying to create emotional responses, affective responses at the very least, I'm pretty sure a lot of people have a much more emotional response to when they see Kirby than when they see the parade of nameless, semi-bald white guys who were the protagonists in video games from like 2006 to 2011.
Yeah. Even
though the nameless, bald white guys were way more photorealistic.
Yeah. That's true. That's true.
Okay. Well, so out of these early times, and we covered this in like a previous episode, and it kind of lends to like what Michael's talking about with like, you know, reducing the amount of something can sometimes allow people to like use their imagination to move on stuff. We start talking about tabletop's influence on narrative or story in games. And I think everybody's primarily thought is like D&D. You know, players telling stories to other players at a circular table, you know, throwing dice, you know, talking about going into like fighting dragons and stuff like that. I think translates really well into like how people who were developing games might have been thinking about stories when they were writing, say, Colossal Cave Adventure or something like that, you know? And I know, Michael, you're a little bit more like knowledgeable about like tabletop with its influence on stuff like this, because like I know that was like an area for you. So,
it is interesting. I mean, you can, as we've discussed many times on this podcast at this point, you can basically draw a straight line from tabletop role-playing games to the earliest computer role-playing games. Mm-hmm. You know, you need to look no further than the Plato mainframe games that we've talked about, Petit 5, D&D, Moria, Oubliette, all of these things.
Right.
And what's funny, actually, is that, you know, some game academics have actually theorized this connection a little bit more. Espen Arzef, I believe, he is a very important game scholar, and I believe he's the one who actually founded one of the very first game studies journals in the discipline. I believe it's just called Game Studies, and it's online. Actually, it's open source. You can read pretty much everything in the journal for free. Around about 2017, he had a article. I believe it was in this article. I could be misremembering this, but he talks about kind of the necessity of paying attention to tabletop role-playing games from a game studies perspective, because surprise, surprise, and I tell this to all of my colleagues who I know that are doing game studies, tabletop role-playing games are actually woefully overlooked in the discipline. Everyone actually tends to prefer looking at game studies. But Arzeth is of a mind that this is actually wrong, because when you look at things like a computer role-playing game, what you're effectively doing is you're looking at a game in which the role of the dungeon master has been automated. That's effectively what the algorithm is doing and the code is doing when you're looking at something like, say, Baldur's Gate. And so when you're thinking about narrative in kind of these early role-playing games that are attempting to emulate something like tabletop, one of the biggest problems is how could you possibly code the endless possibilities that are available to you from a tabletop perspective? I mean, I think the short answer is you can't. Though I will say that some of the best video games I've ever played have probably come as a result of developers genuinely trying to do so. Larian, for instance, with Baldur's Gate 3, has produced a game with so many branching pathways and interconnected web-like narrative structures that at moments it really does kind of feel like you could do whatever you want. And I'll say that's probably the biggest influence of tabletop role-playing games on video games.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'd say that's a big part of the major, probably two of the biggest games last year were Baldur's Gate 3 and Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, both of which were, remarked upon for their, wow, I feel like I can do anything I want, being, a large driver of why those games were as well received as they were. Right. And I don't know about this, but maybe Michael, you'll be able to answer this question for me. But I know a lot of early tabletop gaming, pre-D&D stuff, was more wargaming, simulation-based, historical-based stuff.
Yes.
Is there any line you can draw between that early tabletop gaming and the kind of beginnings of the stuff showing up in computers?
It's harder to say. I mean, very, very noticeably, tabletop gaming and video games both start as war games.
Yeah.
Right? A commonly accepted candidate for the first video game ever made, for instance, is Space War. Mm-hmm. And most of the earliest tabletop games actually can have their origins traced to military strategy simulation training that was being done in Prussian military academies in the 18th century.
Yeah, but it seems like the impetus in both cases was sort of the same, was that the next step was a desire to take this much more mechanical thing and add narrative, because I know that some of the guys who eventually went on to develop original D&D, part of what they were doing early on was they were playing these what's the Napoleonic Wars kind of simulation war games.
Yeah.
But they have a guy who was in charge of tracking, okay, you're in charge of this army, you're in charge of this army, but you're playing historical characters, and you can write, letters to each other as those characters to maybe try and create alliances and these sorts of things, and we'll track a whole campaign over multiple different sessions. These are the sort of things that very clearly link into the establishment of D&D, because the goal really became how can we add more narrative to this thing?
Yeah. So one of the earliest examples of exactly what you're talking about is a game called Braunstein. It was exactly as you've described. There were basically these clubs that would be on college campuses where people would be playing effectively a war game, but the club would expand to be upwards of 20 plus people, where in addition to playing things like the military generals around this, I'm not sure if it's fictional or if it's a real place, but this siege of this city called Braunstein, you would have people playing the generals, of course, but then you would also have somebody standing in as the mayor of the town, perhaps somebody who is standing in as the, chief of police, somebody representing the farmers guild or whatever. it ended up kind of turning into this open-ended autotelic, which means to say without necessarily a win condition or a point, ongoing collaborative narrative in which people were kind of just excited to role play and make believe in this kind of shared space and contribute to a ongoing story.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point, and actually I think Dave Arneson, one of the first developers for D&D alongside Gary Gygax, was a fan of Braunstein. I believe I ended up reading about this in some D&D books.
Heard the stories about Braunstein playing it.
Okay.
Fun side note, and this will probably get cut from the episode because it's not super relevant. Early days. You ever heard the term grognard before?
Yes.
Jeremy?
I have not.
Okay, so grognard is sort of like, oh yeah, those old fuddy-duddy guys who like play super simulationist D&D, who will like make you count your like weight in gold so you don't go like, they're grognards.
Gotcha.
Right? Do you know where the term comes from, Michael?
I might, but I've forgotten for the moment.
So the story for the term grognard comes from back when these guys were playing these Napoleonic War simulation games. Because, like, historically speaking, there was the most elite group of soldiers in Napoleon's army were called les greniers. And the reason they were called les greniers is because they were elite and because they were veterans, they had earned a right that none of the other soldiers had, which was they got to complain. And Le Grenier roughly translated to the grumblers. Bastardized into grognards. So the history of like fucking naming people who like to bitch in games funny names goes back to the very beginning.
That's great. That's really funny.
It's hilarious.
I
Not super relevant, but very funny.
just had a really interesting thought because like we're talking about like with like the D&D in terms of like influencing like with like narrative stuff, and because in Michael you were talking about like the Petit 5 and the Play-Doh games. We some of the early games that we were thinking about that we went over when we talked about that episode was like people building Star Trek games.
Yes.
And it makes me wonder about like television around that time's like influence on game developers in terms of like telling those stories. Like I'm not a Star Trek. I've never really watched Star Trek, but I could see where its appeal and like early Star Wars' appeal to like tell grander narratives in games would be an influencing factor.
Yeah, I mean, I think so many people were just kind of interested in the idea of being able to participate in these universes that they loved. I mean, I've mentioned this book on the podcast in the past, but The Friendly Orange Glow, the Play-Doh book.
Yeah.
He talks a lot about Empire, which is the one of the first online games, the first MMO potentially, with a Star Trek theme. And one of the funniest things about these stories about Empire is that part of the fun was actually all of the players, who went to the same university, going to a diner at midnight after gaming for hours and just recounting stories to each other and to the patrons of the diner, what had happened over the course of that day in terms of, their attack on, a Klingon fleet, or battling a Romulan invasion of their home planet. Again, these things that we might say are examples of having narrativity versus being a narrative, but nevertheless, this collaborative storytelling kind of process.
Yeah, it was just a thought I had as we were like talking about it. So,
oh yeah, and I mean that goes back or continues on even further into games history. There's a fairly well-known interview with a guy who did all the writing for the original like first two Mass Effect games. Like their like very clear intention was like, we are doing our own IP, but it's going to be our version of Star Trek. And you could see it coming across very heavily.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so I guess like spinning out of this like era where D&D is starting to influence, we can talk about like stuff that was going on in the 80s and 90s with like MUDs and CRPGs, which we're kind of touching on. Text-based adventures, same thing. Point-and-click adventure games are kind of new, and then JRPGs slash just like RPGs in general. And a quote I have from the History of Video Game Narrative said, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, attitudes began to change. Narrative became an increasingly important aspect of game design. For example, Japanese role-playing games such as Final Fantasy placed a stronger emphasis on story, which not only justified the gameplay, but also featured unique settings and characters that would develop as the games continued. In the case of Final Fantasy, its many sequels would each tell different stories while employing similar gameplay, indicating a preference towards narrative first and gameplay as a way of maintaining excitement. Developers were expressing greater interest in video games as a storytelling medium. Which, I will say, in terms of this quote, the first Final Fantasy, its story is very, very bare bones. I don't think Final Fantasy really started trying to tell like a story until like maybe like 2 and 3. And then beyond.
I mean, you're definitely right that like they get like the progress of Final Fantasy series as a game was like to emphasize characters and story more and more and more as it went along. But I think it would be wrong to sort of underestimate like how much what they were doing at the time was telling way more of a story than their contemporaries.
Yeah, that's true. And you think about like in that time frame, with like MUDs and CRPGs like we were talking about with like Moria and Oblique and like even this time like Ultima is showing up onto the screen. It's kind of more along the lines of what we were talking about earlier with like something like Rogue, where it's like you open a manual. Oh, you're in this world. These are the things that exist. Go out and explore things. And then you think about like, I would say like they're more player driven with a story setting versus you are this character telling this story. I hope that makes sense. And some of these earlier like computer games and even like, now with the 80s and 90s, you got the advance of consoles. So it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier. Like now you have Mario is like the first Zelda game is showing up where you're given a sword and told to go explore the land of Hyrule. There's maybe a pig guy out there and he's kidnapped Princess Zelda. Good luck. Even to like some of the arcades, I think Michael, me and you talked about it, or, Pac-Man was the first game to ever have a cutscene where it's like Pac-Man chasing ghosts.
Yes.
Story kind of starts folding into some of the more graphical stuff that's happening in games versus as to where they were now previously just like minor graphics on screen. Now they are, the more visually appealing because things are starting to develop. I was never much of a point and click adventure person. I think I remember like Monkey Island, and those are more like here's interactive story. I don't know. Did you ever play any of those, Michael?
I probably did. But more recently, I can't think of any that come to mind. I mean, I think probably the only game that I would describe as maybe being point and click that I've enjoyed in the past couple of years has been Kentucky Route Zero.
I've heard of that game,
but it's really quite good.
Yeah.
But I will say that I have to be in a fundamentally different mood and mindset to want to play something like Kentucky Route Zero versus, I don't know, Tears of the Kingdom, for instance.
Yeah.
One I would actively describe as being fun. The other I would describe as being perhaps stimulating.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think Kentucky Route Zero is telling an interesting story and it's doing a lot of things media-wise that I find conceptually very interesting. Fun is not a word that I would use to describe a lot of point-and-click adventure games, but,
I'll say now, I know Adam has played a lot of point-and-click adventure games.
I, as somebody who will like suffer through some of the worst garbage in the world to like see a story through if I'm interested, I've played a lot of point-and-click adventure games. I've gone back and played a lot of the old ones over the years. Let's see. I played Grim Fandango. I played the first two Monkey Islands. I never finished, but I played the Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. I am a huge fan of The Longest Journey. I played some of the Sam & Max games, the old ones as well as the new ones. I'm really hyped for the remake of Riven they're doing, because I've always wanted to go back and play that, and that looks really cool. But I will never be one to defend the item daisy chaining gameplay as particularly engaging.
Yeah. I think those games as a whole, like in like the early 90s and stuff like that, were like good precursors into like where we were going in terms of like more narrative focused games.
Well, I think what they did particularly, and part of the reason they were so successful, was the way they presented, by which I mean the technology used. Because a lot of those games, you would have like a kind of rudimentary character who doesn't look great moving around on completely hand-drawn backgrounds, or in the case of Riven and Mist, I can't remember what technology they're using for those games. Good Lord, that's going to bug me.
They were like 3D rendered like backgrounds.
They're like fully 3D rendered backgrounds, if I remember correctly. But like, because they were taking that like style, they like held up really well. They were some of the most like visually engaging and beautiful games at the time, because they were working with like static backgrounds and one moving character. So you get these absolutely like gorgeous backgrounds. I'm reminded of like, if you go back and look at the backgrounds in some of the early 3D Final Fantasies that were, you know, around the same time, actually, that some of these games and a little later, they were, you know, functioning in a lot of the ways the same way. Like, we all remember what Final Fantasy VII's backgrounds looked like.
Yes.
Well, they owe a lot of like the ideas behind how to present that to these early point and click adventure games.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, Cloud is not a particularly compelling to look at character when he's a little chibi Popeye guy, but the city of Midgar sticks out in our minds in the same way that I will like always remember the backgrounds in Grim Fandango.
Right.
Which are incredible.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You know, those kind of early, like the games with like the 80s and 90s, like these kind of go forward. And I guess like for a quick aside, and we briefly mentioned this yesterday with notes, is like, so not only did we have JRPGs at the times, there were also Western style RPGs, and I didn't find a whole lot, but I know like the sample that I found, which was like JRPGs tend to focus more on storytelling, character development, as to where Western RPGs focus more on player choice and exploration. I think the example I saw was like for every, you know, Final Fantasy game, there was also like a Skyrim. I was like, I guess that's kind of fair, like in terms of comparison. Oh yeah, wow, those are actually some very interesting backgrounds for Grim Fandango.
I'm posting some of the like screenshots from Grim Fandango, and let's just keep, you know, in perspective here. Grim Fandango came out in 1992.
Wow,
like it is a masterclass in like leveraging the technology to present things in the best way it possibly can. Which is part of why it was so striking and why so many people go back to it, I think.
Yeah.
Not to kind of pull us back to the old point too much, but it's worth like, let me check something out real quick. Like, keeping in mind that comparatively, other games from 1992 include like Super Mario Kart, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Final Fantasy V, Alone in the Dark.
Oh God, Alone in the Dark.
Yeah, but like you know, if you go,
I remember playing that game on a friend's 3DO. The Angel system.
Here's a screenshot. Just compare what Alone in the Dark in 1992 looked like to the Grim Fandango I just showed you.
Oh yeah, no,
it's night and day.
That Alone in the Dark stuff looks like when I played Kingsfield.
Yeah. And, you know, to some degree, it's because they're working with like game design, which they don't have to spend as much time mechanically, like making sure you can interact with the rest of the world in that sort of way.
Right.
Which leads to some of the limitations and problems and ways the game isn't as engaging to like actively play. But at the same time, like I said earlier, like we see as time goes on, it's finding better and better ways to integrate gameplay and narrative together
Yeah.
And it gets closer and it gets closer and it's getting closer, and eventually you kind of get to where we are now, where these things are almost tied together in an inseparable way in a lot of ways.
Right. I guess this leads us into like talking about like the late 90s, early 2000s, which I've called it like the story boom. Like games start doing more story stuff. And I have a quote here from the same little thing, which said, with time, first-person shooters began to really explore the use of complex story and narrative elements and began to pose challenging, even philosophical questions to players who were willing to ponder them. Classics such as Deus Ex and System Shock asked what it meant to be human, or what would you do if the fate of millions were in your hands. Furthermore, they used first-person shooter gameplay not only to increase tension, but also create diverging narrative paths where players' decisions actually affected the outcome of the story. I also would like to add to this is I think other games that started doing really interesting thing with stories was, BioWare kind of comes onto the scene in the late 90s, starts producing a bunch of D&D games like Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter Nights, Icewind Dale. But then for me personally, I remember the first BioWare game I ever played was Knights of the Old Republic, and that game being like, oh wow, this story is really cool. I got like super invested in that game. I replayed that game numerous times because the story was just like so exciting at the time. It was something, I'd never really experienced. I remember also like in the same vein as like Deus Ex and System Shock playing the original Thief games, like where it's like, oh, here comes why is the genre of that game immersive simulators start becoming like a thing, and those like really interesting ways to tell stories.
Those are the games that are really starting to kind of push environmental storytelling and those sorts of things. And you bring up the BioWare, just to kind of place us in time here. Baldur's Gate 1 releases in 1998. Mm-hmm. Arguably one of the biggest masterclasses in like writing in a video game. Planescape Torment releases in 1999. So just a lot of stuff is happening in that time period. And I also think we're at the point where like studios made games faster.
Yeah.
In this time period than they do now, which allowed like innovation and trying new things to happen a lot more. And I think it's interesting to think about like probably have more people pushing like risky narrative like takes in video games, or trying new things that they weren't sure were going to work because like if it doesn't work, we'll make another one next year.
Yeah, it also makes me think about like around this 2000s, Half-Life is coming out. They're starting to do more interesting things with like environmental storytelling as well. Generally like the PC area has like some really interesting games that are going on around that same time as well as like consoles. I think, even in the next few months when me and Michael explore our October game, like Silent Hill is a great example of a really good narrative game. The early Resident Evil, as campy as it was doing new things. Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, the arrival of the PlayStation and Xbox kind of like helped, I think, with that. A game I remember very well playing around that time was Eternal Darkness and, Metal Gear Solid.
The games that would mess with the medium.
So I think we're highlighting like a really interesting thing here, which is sort of, we've talked a lot about, like the only real like Japanese games we've really mentioned are Final Fantasy. Right. So if we're thinking about this, like how we're telling stories and these sorts of things, I think it's worth at least briefly touching on, like, are there core differences between a JRPG and a Western RPG or Western games?
I'd say so. I feel like there were other Japanese games. I feel like they did a better job of like focusing on like the characters and telling like personal stories, as to where like Western games are like, check out this cool world.
I think you're right, but I think a lot of it has to do with like the fundamental difference between Baldur's Gate and Final Fantasy V same year. Or not same year, like Final Fantasy VII, which is coming out like 2 years before Baldur's Gate. Or your Oblivions and your Personas is like a lot of Japanese RPGs are focused on like you are playing a scripted character who is already a character. Like the main character is a written character. They might not talk as much as the other characters, but they are a person before you sit down to play the game. Whereas like the first thing you do in most Western RPGs is get slapped in the face with the character creator.
Right. Make your character.
I will say this does create, some interesting exceptions, obviously.
Oh yeah.
Insofar as I would describe something like Dark Souls or Elden Ring as being much more Western of an RPG seeming, despite being from a Japanese company.
Yeah, and I mean, you could easily point to a lot of Western games that have like scripted main characters. They just don't tend to be the RPGs. I mean, like even silent protagonist Gordon Freeman is a character.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, that's like
life is a JRPG.
That's what I was thinking about, like with Deus Ex, where you're playing a named character.
That's where we've got put it down. Title of the episode: Half-Life is a JRPG.
Half-Life is a JRPG. Yeah.
I'll write that down, and I'm sure as our editor listens to this, we'll get so much shit. But it's okay. Y'all can email us at the Instruction Booklet at 86@gmail.com.
Your hate mail.
Bother them, but leave me alone. I have nothing to do with this.
I wrote this one down when I was talking about the 2000s, and the only reason I brought it up is because we were talking about the news earlier this year. Is the game Spec Ops: The Line for doing something very interesting for a military shooter.
Michael wanted to talk about ludonarrative dissonance, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you could use Spec Ops: The Line as a jumping point.
Yeah. Well, let's circle back to that, because when you talk about ludonarrative dissonance, there is one game in particular, actually, that you have to talk about.
Oh.
And that's BioShock. Because in around about, I think, 2007 or 2008, the term itself, ludonarrative dissonance, was coined in a blog post by Clint Hawking, who was a game designer. Ludonarrative dissonance is something that can happen in video games because games eventually have developed such, capacity for rich narrative and or storytelling that you can have this issue where sometimes the game seemingly conflicts with the story that's being told. And Clint Hawking's argument in his little blog post called, not little blog post, but his blog post called Ludonarrative Dissonance in BioShock, effectively tries to make the argument that BioShock exhibits ludonarrative dissonance because BioShock as a game is fundamentally anti-capitalist in terms of its themes and its story. However, the particular mechanic of choosing whether or not to harvest the little sisters or spare them defeats the intention or, the kind of the game's theme, because you're actually mechanically rewarded more for harvesting the little sisters than you are for sparing them. And what's interesting to me is that Clint Hawking kind of uses this as an example to say ultimately that BioShock's gameplay does not reinforce the story that it's trying to tell. And so ultimately he decides that BioShock has ludonarrative dissonance. Now, I would say, and this kind of goes back to something that Adam was saying earlier, this question of, do I keep playing the game because I think it's fun, or am I interested in kind of actually seeing where the story is going and how it's going to unfold? I think that one mistake that sometimes scholars like to make when they levy this accusation of ludonarrative dissonance is they treat narrative and gameplay as still actually two separate things rather than things that can inform each other. And I would kind of levy a counter, or rather a rebuttal to Clint Hawking, which is to say, actually, you are rewarded for choosing to spare the little sisters. You're rewarded by getting the good ending for the game. And so even if you would argue that mechanically, as a player, you're not rewarded by getting stronger for sparing the little sisters, I would say, actually, for many people, the narrative reward is the reward. And honestly, I feel like it might actually defeat the purpose of the games moralizing for you to be rewarded for doing the right thing. It seems almost like it would make more sense for the game to be as it is, which is to say, you sometimes want to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because you're going to get rewarded for it.
The classic divide in all of the KOTOR side quests, where if you're playing the light side, you're confronted with like this difficult problem that you eventually have to kill something with a laser sword to solve. But if you're evil, you're just like, give me your money, bitch.
Going full renegade.
You kind of wind up being mustache twirling evil, but if you're playing evil, you wind up with a lot more equipment and money a lot faster.
Makes me think about like you talking about like BioShock, and I guess this is like spoilers for BioShock. The part in the game, and this was like one of those moments where I'm just thinking about BioShock, and one of those like, oh shit moments of when you find out that the guy you've been on the radio with the entire time is the bad guy with the would you kindly. It never clicked with me until like you get to that point and you're like, oh shit. I've been doing this man's bidding the entire fucking time. Like
the moment where the game kind of makes you question the fact that you just blindly do whatever the NPCs tell you to in video games. Yeah.
Like
Right.
That's like an interesting like story beat for me, like thinking about it. And like it makes me wonder, like when you're talking about like this like you know, disconnect almost like with like, should I do the optimal thing versus should I do the, you know, non-optimal thing in terms of a choice? Like sometimes like when games like funnel you down this like pathway and you think you're doing those choices when in reality you're not.
And it's been a long time since I played the original BioShock, but I'm not sure if they like explicitly tell the player that you'll get more stuff if you kill them.
I think it shows it on the choice screen. Like when you find the little sister, like and it has like the left or right. One of them will show like more Adam versus the other one won't.
Well, let me look something up real quick.
That's fine.
Because
while you're looking that up,
pull an interesting.
While you're looking something up, I want to make an interesting distinction here. Some early game scholars were interested in trying to differentiate between things that were just narratives and things that could actually be described as games. And I think that BioShock presents an interesting dilemma for this because Markku Eskelinen has a formulation, or rather, N. Catherine Hales quotes Markku Eskelinen, saying that we may say that with games, the user interprets in order to configure, whereas in works whose primary interest is narrative, the user configures in order to interpret. In one case, you know, the point being the game itself and the game as it is played as a game. In the other case, you play the game as a way of getting access to the story, which is your primary interest. And BioShock has this interesting dilemma of, you know, well, if you don't care about the story, then actually, you know, it's a game if you choose to do the evil thing and harvest the little sisters. And if you do care about the story and you want the good ending, then perhaps BioShock transforms from a game into a narrative. If we buy into this distinction of the framing.
Gotcha.
But
so obviously, since this is on the remastered and on Steam, it's not telling the full story. There's no way to actually know or track it. But I'm looking at the like global achievements percentages on Steam. And apparently for BioShock Remastered, about 20% of the global players have completed a run where they didn't harvest any little sisters.
Wow.
So obviously you've got a certain percentage that didn't beat the game, a certain percentage that did only beat it once and maybe harvested one because they weren't sure what was going to happen. But like that means 20% of the people who owned that game on Steam, whether they knew it going in or not, made a choice to do the non-optimal thing for story reasons.
I'm fairly certain the first time I played BioShock, I didn't harvest any little sisters because mentally it was one of those like personality. I was like, no, this seems like, you know, the right thing to do is I'll figure it out.
First run was a good ending, but I don't know if I was completely clean. It's been a long time.
But I guess that brings us to like where I was like talking about like just mentioning Spec Ops because, you know, earlier this year it got delisted and that game was known very well for having a very interesting story, basically talking about like horrors of war kind of stuff, where forcing you to do things that weren't the best. I've watched playthroughs of it before, and it's just like there are parts of that game that made me feel uncomfortable just watching someone playing it. I could only imagine how that game would make someone personally feel playing it. And that is an interesting subject in my mind, like just thinking about like a game that invokes that kind of like visceral response from someone.
Yeah.
Like,
Go ahead.
I know that way earlier in this, we talked about stuff, and I mentioned this idea of like what narratively games can do as a storytelling medium that like the other more traditional mediums can or can't do. And I said then, and I still believe that there's really not like, I don't think games can or can't do anything the other ones can or can't do, but which is a terrible way of saying it. But what they do better really is the first person narrative, like putting you directly in the shoes of the protagonist, having it make choices that you feel like you made, because you just don't get a lot of like first person movies or first person novels. Mm-hmm. They do exist, but they're a lot more rare. And it's going to, tease out different emotions.
Right.
Yes. I do think Spec Ops, as well as many shooters that are perhaps, I would say, less successful than Spec Ops at critiquing, I guess, I don't know, military misconduct, are sometimes more viable targets for accusations of ludonarrative dissonance than something like BioShock. Spec Ops, as well as something like, let's say, Call of Duty, especially some of the more recent Call of Duty games, love to indulge in this kind of reflection upon the horrors of war. War is a bad thing. War as, kind of maybe, they would probably argue a necessary evil. But like Modern Warfare, the more recent Modern Warfare especially, really was interested in kind of thinking about, how terrible it can be because innocents die. There's this idea that indiscriminate killing is a bad thing. Spec Ops really kind of does that. I mean, there's some horrifying scenes in Spec Ops, especially like the white phosphorus scene, is harrowing. But then, the critique that I would levy against something like Call of Duty, and to a lesser extent Spec Ops, is why is the shooting so damn fun?
Right.
Why is it so tight? Why do I get an amazing, audio feedback when I land a headshot and a pop-up on my screen that says, great job, plus 100 points, and I unlock a camo for it?
Well, I mean, to some degree, the answer to that is the always and ever looming sort of specter of the world we live in when we're dealing with any kind of art, which is like, you can make the most poignant critique of a thing in the world, but if it's not compelling in a way that gets people to buy it, nobody will ever see it or read it.
God, you're just
like, if you want people to play your game, you got to make it fun, right?
You're just reminding me of like the conversation I had with someone the other day about like Duchamp and like his art, like trying to point out the like
and to kind of hammer this point a little bit more, but like to bring up something that loops back in later. I know that I would bet my entire owning of everything that more people have played Spec Ops: The Line than played Kentucky Route Zero.
Yeah, that's probably fair.
Okay.
Spec Ops is fun, and Kentucky Route Zero is not.
Yeah.
So this kind of leads us into like,
and I want to be clear. That doesn't mean I think just something has to be fun for it to be good.
Oh, of course.
But it is absolutely a factor.
All right. So this kind of leads us into our last area where we're talking about like where we're at today and where we're kind of going. I would say, and before I bring up the hot button topic.
Well, you think that's going to be the hot button topic? I have news for you.
So I would say in today's world, like we are seeing in today's like landscape of video games in terms of like narrative, we are seeing, really interesting, like you've brought up this Kentucky Route Zero, a game I've played. I'm thinking of stuff like thinking about games like we talked about yesterday and like the notes with like games like Firewatch. I also like another game that I think about from like the same perspective of telling a very interesting story from a first person perspective is Portal and Portal 2. I loved those games. The writing in those games are amazing. Rest in peace, Space Corps. And we're seeing games win awards now for their stories. And I think this like inherently leads to the thing that I kind of starred in the notes. Was an article from The Atlantic called "Video Games Are Better Without Stories." It got a lot of like spotlight last year. Was it last year when it came out? I think so. Hang on, let me double check the actual date on this thing. It's been so long. I thought it was last year. I could be wrong. It's 2017 was when this thing came out. And basically, and I read through it. We've all, I think Adam skimmed it. Michael knows way more about it than I do. And my thoughts are, when I got through reading it, was, man, this person has some really tone deaf takes on games. And it's funny that we talked about BioShock, because that's kind of where like the crux of this like article rests. It was like, man, they're like so far up BioShock's ass that, I can't see daylight. But they also bring up some like other games like, Gone Home, Edith Finch, which are games that have won awards based on story. And now that I'm saying it out loud and thinking about other like story examples of like really interesting games that are telling very unique stories nowadays, but doing it in like different ways, is like, I was even thinking about like Celeste now. Like Celeste has a really fun story, but like, the gameplay also kind of matches the story of like difficult trials and tribulations and stuff like that. So yeah. And I see like nowadays in like terms of like where we could be going in terms of games, like you think about like how the games medium is like, and technology is expanding in such ways that, like, we have VR and more motion controls have become a popular thing. And I just, in general, like game stories are becoming way more in depth and way more interesting in terms of like just the subject matter which they talk about, how they're telling them, all kinds of stuff. So yeah, so I'll open this up and let you go. And so hear about y'all's guys' thoughts.
I'll give some background a little bit first on the author of the article. Mm-hmm. He's a video game studies scholar and object-oriented ontologist by the name of Ian Bogost.
So that's what Triple O stands for.
Yeah, or Bogost. I've heard it pronounced both ways. So Dr. Bogost, if you're listening to this, I apologize. But he is a video game studies scholar who is actually good buddies with my advisor at my university, another object-oriented ontologist by the name of Timothy Morton. I've read a lot of Bogost's stuff, and actually I'm going to be teaching some of it this semester. So I am familiar with his work, namely, one of the most important ideas that he has given a useful name in video game studies, that being the idea of procedural rhetoric. So it's not like he's just some random shitter on the internet with a hot take, even though perhaps in this case we're not a huge fan of the take in this essay. But for better or worse, Bogost's argument in this essay does seem, I don't know, like a little bit nitpicky. The idea being that like video games should perhaps aspire to be more than just the next in the long line of succession from different kinds of narrative media. I don't know, from theater to novels to film to television. I guess there's a desire for there to be something perhaps more ambitious. I know he critiques it for being like a very unambitious goal.
The quote that I've got on that toward the very end is he's got a paragraph where he says the true accomplishment of what remains of Edith Finch is that it invites players to abandon the dream of interactive storytelling at last. Yes, sure, you can tell a story in a game, but what a lot of work that is when it's so much easier to watch television or to read. A greater ambition, which the game accomplishes more effectively anyway, to show the delightful curiosity that can be made when stories, games, comics, game engines, virtual environments, and anything else for that matter can be taken apart and put back together again unexpectedly. And it's an interesting quote because on the one hand, like, it's a call for like strive to be more, which is, you know, that's fair. I think if you were to look at the history of video game narrative, I don't want to like downplay it, but there's a lot of bad writing and a lot of bad stories. And I think that's a lot of the case because like people had limited opinions on what could be accomplished in this medium. I think a lot of that's changing in the last 10 years or so. And Edith Finch and other games are good examples of that. But I worry about this idea of like, but what a lot of work that is. It's so much easier to read television, watch television or read, but like, just because something's easier doesn't mean it's not worth doing the harder thing.
Right.
And yeah, like go ahead, like aspire to being a virtual environment that can be taken apart and put back together again unexpectedly. But like you can make the process of taking it apart and putting it back together again be part of how you tell your story.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, and he might even respond to this by name in the article. I actually, it's been a while since I've read it in depth, but I mentioned earlier in the episode Janet Murray's book Hamlet on the Holodeck. And, you know, Bogost is kind of critical, I guess, of this myth of the holodeck. This idea that, you know, ultimately that games will just be, I don't know, some kind of more immersive storytelling form rather than, I don't know, some completely different kind of form of entertainment medium that is more willing to celebrate its algorithmic, you know, ergodic, you know, to use one of Espen Arzeth's terms, qualities rather than just, I don't know, being a narrative that requires a player to press some buttons. But I think in doing so, I'm convinced that Bogost kind of falls into the trap that some ludologists are guilty of, which is that, you know, he's kind of imagining that the narrative in many of these games is superfluous or secondary. It's a rather contingent quality with regard to the game. Because if we're concerned more with the game as game rather than the game as narrative, then, I don't know, you're kind of treating the story as if it's irrelevant to what the game is doing. Like, the game could have any story and it would just be fundamentally the same game. Which I just think is wrong, because I think some of the most basic forms of free-form play that human beings engage in is actually built around constructed collaborative narratives, even as kids, you know, playing cops and robbers, that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I think ultimately, as polemical as the title of the article is, I think it's ultimately kind of a safe take and one that I could just take or leave.
I think the biggest issue I have is like the premise comes out of this idea of the holodeck. And he conjectures the holodeck as just like a complicated, quote, a complicated dream of a novel. To which I say, I don't think you fully understood the speculative nature of that technology on Star Trek. Early on, it kind of was just, yeah, go run around in an interactive novel. But like they took it a lot of other places over the years with that show. And like the holodeck isn't speculative of interactive novels. It's speculative of a lot of different things. And it's about sort of how you can build stories that are more focused on sort of traditional storytelling elements, but you can also do things that are a lot more, you know, free form. Hilariously enough, I can go back to worlds, that virtual environments that can be taken apart and put back together again. And I think of the recent Hitman games, which have a narrative, but like every level is sort of a challenge to accomplish your character's goals in that narrative, which are obviously killing certain targets, but you're given like reasons why. But the actual like gameplay in those things is you're plopped into the middle of this virtual environment, and it's all about like how you can nudge one thing and see how it makes everything else react. And you can do all sorts of wild things, but it's different stories about how you achieved this goal. Right. The version of Agent 47 who is the cold sniper who has shot every single target from the farthest distance away is a very different character and a very different story than from the guy who wanders around in clown costumes and drags people into coat closets.
Right. And the narrative is actually in that case, and who knows, we might say this is having narrativity rather than being a narrative, but
yeah.
The aesthetic dressing of the outlandish kind of Rube Goldberg machines of death and destruction that you can create in Hitman. I mean, it would be silly for a ludologist to suggest that it's just dominoes, right? Just go play dominoes instead. It's the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, being reductive is not really productive in that sort of sense. And it's worth putting in mind that, like, the setup for this game is literally like a riff on Secret Agents, right? But instead of like taking it seriously, the game developers sort of realized that the entire premise was a little bit silly.
Yeah.
So like, it's one of the few games that I'd be like, it's kind of an absurdist video game, and it knows it, and it plays with that like narratively and thematically.
Yes.
Except for that,
which
last
I think
one.
is great.
Except for that last level, that one I think they went the wrong direction with it, but oh well.
I have not played all of the levels in the new one, so
is good. Would recommend.
So I guess I don't know. I was just like with Michael, like what where would you say like where things are today with like narrative in games, and like where you think that they are going?
I think that some of the past couple of years has produced actually some of my favorite narratives in video games ever. I mean, it's a far cry from EA heralding the death of the single player game that they tried to do like a decade ago. Because since then, I mean, we've had we've had the God of War games, the newer ones, The Last of Us Part 1 and 2, Disco Elysium, one of my personal favorite games of all time. We've had Death Stranding, we've had Alan Wake 2, we had Control, we had Baldur's Gate 3. I mean, I don't know. I feel like I'm encouraged that as long as people have interesting stories to tell, that these stories will find their ways into various forms of media. But that there are people with interesting stories to tell who are interested in video games. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to continue to keep an eye on the indie space, but as also developers who I trust have kind of developed a reputation for themselves as being somewhat carried by the quality of their writing, which I think CD Projekt Red to a lesser extent as well. I think even on release, as janky and broken as Cyberpunk 2077 was, I actually really liked it on release because the story was so good.
Makes me think of like
suffered through it.
Makes me think of how like even like I guess with the announcement this week of like the secret levels, like how as a medium and like stuff is evolving, we're getting more stories. Like you said Cyberpunk, my brain was like, oh right, Edge Runners was like amazing. And it's this story set in a game world
that started as a tabletop game,
or
as a novel.
Or you think about like Castlevania got adapted into an anime and it was amazing, and we have a Mario movie, and like The Last of Us was like an Emmy Award winning TV show.
I think a lot of what's happened that's defined like why we're seeing a kind of a I hesitate to say it, but I kind of want to say a golden age for narrative in video games at the moment is because what we're really seeing is the first generation that grew up on video games being the people in charge of making video games. So they're no longer marketing to the idea of this is a kid's toy.
Oh, yeah.
Right. They're willing to make content for kids, but also for adults, and they're thinking creatively and fully about like the stories they want to tell to their particular audiences, and targeting them well and doing a good job with it because they take the medium seriously, because to them it's just been just as important and just as much a part of their lives as novels have, or movies have been. And I think, the longer video games become just part of society and part of history that the people who are part of society have lived in, the more sort of that you're going to see. I do have some trepidations. I think there's a lot of people out there who are interested mostly in are automatically willing to abandon narrative if it's going to get them the next big Fortnite.
But bro, Fortnite has a deep, rich lore history. Okay, I can't say that with a straight face.
Maybe it does. I honestly don't know, but I don't think so. But the other thing we got to think about here is like, well, one of the biggest difficulties with narratives in games is you have to be willing to account for the different ways players will interact with the story, right? You ever seen any of the like write-ups and books? Like BioWare has a program built specifically just to track the scripts they write because they're too big, because you have like so many different branching decisions and the things of that nature. Like it's a massive amount of writing to write like a full-size AAA, whatever you want to call it, video game. And it's unique challenge and different. And now you got people who are looking at this and going, what if I can just make all of my NPCs driven by AI?
Yep.
And to one degree, you go, well, that means you can seriously cut down a lot of the writing effort on that and redouble it and put it back on making sure you can really branch stuff in the main story. But in the quest, AI isn't there yet.
Right.
So narrative's going to go interesting places. I think the way people write narrative in video games is going to change a lot in the next 20 years. But I don't think it's going away. I think the death of the single player narrative driven game is greatly exaggerated.
I mean, look at some of the other like fantastic like examples of like single player games that I would consider AAA as, even though I played it long after it came out, was like the freaking Insomniac Spider-Man games. Like,
oh yeah,
here's an existing IP that we're going to tell a really fun story in.
They got the Wolverine game coming out.
Yeah, like I guess that's why my brain went back to like, I didn't think about it until I was talking about it. I was like talking about like Portal, and I was just like, I liked that like going back and thinking about, I remember like when Portal 2 was in development, they were like, we've wrote this much lines of dialogue, and I was like, Jesus Christ.
And that game is, I could beat that game in half an hour.
That game is quippy as hell. But then I was thinking about like what Michael was mentioning is like, I really enjoyed Control. I liked that game. The way it blended real people as well as like really interesting narratives into a game was like very fun. Gameplay was kind of so at times, but like the story was like incredibly engaging. I also like weird sci-fi stuff like that. So I think like it's getting, and then I guess I'm thinking about like, and I brought it up yesterday when we were talking about the notes, like the Stanley Parable, like how it kind of like pokes fun at those kind of things.
Yeah. And just for like some comparison's sake, I looked on Google for this. I don't know how accurate this is, so if I'm wrong, please understand I don't have total accuracy on this, but the English word count for the script for Mass Effect 3 is about 430,000 lines of dialogue.
Good Lord.
Mass Effect 2's 450,000. ME1 was about 300,000. So the total word count, no, those are word counts. So the word count for the series is like 85,000. You're still nowhere close to, the classic, like giants of literature where like Lord of the Rings is like 473,000, but like let's compare it to plays. Come on, right? Like,
yeah.
What's the word count? Let me 1 second.
Or like a script for a TV show or a movie.
Word count for Hamlet's 30,000 words. So, they're writing the same amount of words to write Mass Effect 1 that is in one of Shakespeare's longest plays.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's worth like considering this is a massive undertaking if you want to do something of that scope and scale.
Yeah. Well, you've kind of touched on it a little bit already, and you've kind of with that direction. I guess to kind of like follow it up, as I've asked Michael as well, as like, Adam, where would you think that like where narrative is today and where it's going? Like any like additional thoughts you've had based on stuff what you've already said?
The only thing other than what I've already said, I think, is you're going to start to see, and you're already starting to see, more small projects that are not so much interested in like marketing themselves as games, or like even necessarily marketing themselves, like just pieces of interactive media that are interested in like what kind of ways can we tell stories in interactive digital spaces. An example that comes off the top of my head that's more recent was 4 or 5 years ago. Joe Nugent, who's a professor of Irish studies at Boston College, had a whole project he put together that he toured around a little while with. I can't remember what he named it, but it was a like 3D VR version of Ulysses.
Okay.
And like the idea that you could attempt to like translate like a really weird novel into 3D environmental experiential storytelling is like really fascinating. And I think you're going to see like more people do stuff like that, particularly as like the tools for that kind of stuff become more cheaper and more available to people. Mm-hmm. But you're not going to see, I don't think you're going to see much change as far as like people will still be making video games like marketed as video games with narrative of varying levels of complexity.
Yeah.
It's not going away, guys.
Yeah. Okay. Well, cool. All right. Well, we'll do our little bit of our little final thoughts things, and then we'll like wrap things up. And yeah. So I guess Adam, as you're our guest, what are your final thoughts on like kind of like the overall scope of narrative with games and where it started versus like where it is, and just kind of some of the general stuff we've talked about today?
It's fun to kind of look back on the history of it all. I think the thing that sticks with me most, having not like planned this out, but just sort of been thinking about this in prep for this and talking about it with y'all, is this idea of like the reward is emotive and not necessarily mechanical.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And which reminds me hilariously of one of my favorite quotes from Dark Souls 1. When Hawkeye goes talking to you about the war with the dragons, and he says, exhilaration, pride, hatred, rage. The dragons teased out our dearest emotions. Thou will understand one day. At thy twilight, old thoughts return in great waves of nostalgia.
That's a good one.
He's such a good character.
In a lot of ways, the reward for me and like why I play games is because, they make me feel things, and sometimes it's nostalgia, and sometimes I go back and play old games because of that, and they make me feel the same things I felt then, and sometimes I'm disappointed. But that reward for me is so much more compelling than the mechanical in a lot of cases. But that's just the kind of player I am. Yeah. I like to watch the number go up instead of doing the combo.
Big number. That's what I said the other night when I was playing Balatro. Got big number. Big number.
Yep.
So, all right, Michael, what about you? Final thoughts on what we've discussed today, talking about like with narrative in games and stuff like that.
No, I think I've said my fill. Except that if everyone who is listening to this has not played Disco Elysium, you should. That is my final thought.
Is your video still up on YouTube about that?
Yeah, I do have a video essay on YouTube. It's not very good, but it is. I guess I can give you the link. You can put it in the description if you want. It contains spoilers for the game, though, so you really should just go play the game.
Go play the game and then critique Michael's video.
Yeah.
So, okay. Well, and I think I feel like the same way. It's like stories and games were always like I think for me, like as someone who started playing games like really early on and play a lot of like more arcadey stuff, and as time has grown on, I have become more like interested in story. I think it's funny you mentioned like Dark Souls is like one of the, as hard as Souls games have been, I'm always drawn back to like the interesting like stories and like thoughts and stuff that they put behind it. That's part of why I think I love like Dark Souls 3 so much, is because like the whole like ending the world kind of stuff and like people being faced with the end of the world is like such an interesting like narrative thing for me. But like, games with stories have always been, as I've gotten older, have become more like just meaty. Like, I mentioned Transistor. I've played Transistor multiple times at this point now because that game's story still just like hits me like a ton of bricks by the time I get to the end of it. That's just Supergiant Games as a nutshell. They like to just punch me in the face, and I just keep coming back for it. So
yeah, Supergiant's good at that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Bastion was a great game. So, all right, we'll do our little. I'll wrap things up and we'll end things up. But first off, Adam, thanks for being on the show. I appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me on, guys.
Yeah, it's nice.
It's good having you.
It's nice having a different perspective on the show and hearing other people's thoughts. Maybe we'll get some more guests. Maybe we'll have you back at some point when we talk about something that you're like really excited about, and you'll be like, "Hey, I want to hop on the subject." So,
let me know.
Let's see. For the next few months till the rest of the year, we got next month will be episode 17, where we're going over the home computer gaming from the late 70s all the way up. It's part of the reason why I'm reading Masters of Doom right now to prepare myself for that, so we can talk about a small company called id Software. They've made some games. I might have heard. Yeah. After that, we'll have our October, which I think we've settled on. We're going to talk about Silent Hill. Neither me or Michael have played a Silent Hill game, so I'm probably going to wind up streaming Silent Hill 1 and 2 on Duck Station. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I might play the remake when it comes out. So
yeah. November is the last bit of our history while we're still stuck in this video game crash nebula of holy crap, there's so much we have to talk about before we keep moving on. And as we discuss a small upstart company out of Japan who made playing cards called Nintendo. I heard they're kind of a big deal as well. After that, in December, we'll have the obligatory award show, which we'll come up with some random awards. We'll award people stuff. We'll talk about things that's happened in the year of gaming. We have opinions on those. Lots of opinions.
Lots of opinions.
That'll wrap up our year, and then we'll get into January, which we'll finally dig further into the 80s and beyond into next year. We'll finally break our way into the 90s, which will probably move even slower because Jesus Christ, the amount of shit that happens in the 90s. So again, thanks everybody for listening. We'll do our plugs and then we'll wrap things up. Adam, where can the people find you?
They cannot. I am anonymous. You cannot find me. Leave me alone. If you do find me, I will throw hands.
Oh, shit. Okay. Well, all right then. Michael, what about you? Where can the folks find you?
As always, I'm not much on social media, but I'm on Instagram at mackerel_prawns. Mackerel like the fish, prawn like the crustacean, underscore like the line at the bottom of the letter.
He posts videos of him working out and food, so
Yeah, you can see my 415-pound deadlift PR. And in fact, since we've recorded the last episode, I have also finally hit my 225-pound bench press, which is my new PR.
Oh shit! You'll also see pictures of his cat. So,
yes.
As for me, you can find me on my art accounts, which is Press Art F4, which is a nice little play on the word Press Alt F4, which don't do that while you're playing a game. Don't listen to people on the internet. They're terrible. I also stream on my Twitch, twitch.tv/backwardshero, where I've been doing Elden Bros with my friend Six Hill, Shane. I'm on another show called Caging Greatness. We're on hiatus right now, I think. The last movie we did was, oh God, it was that Harry Belafonte movie. Don't go watch that.
You got to do Long Legs.
Yes, we really got to do Long Legs. I've heard such good things about it. I got a new shirt too recently from our friend that has Nicolas in the Cages, and it's like a band of 4 people, and it's got like 3 Nicolas Cages and a John Travolta. So I thought that was pretty funny.
Y'all got to watch The Wicker Man.
We've already seen The Wicker Man.
Oh, good Lord. What about Left Behind? Have you watched Left Behind yet?
That's already been done as well too. So, we also stream on the show. It's twitch.tv/the Instruction Booklet. We have a link tree. It's linktr.ee/Instruction Booklet. It has all of our links on there. So yeah, it's give us follows. Thanks for listening. That's always great because we always appreciate that. We're also real thankful for the AYCH helping us, letting us keep doing our thing, letting us talk for almost 2 hours about stories and games, and letting us go for 16 episodes worth of video game nonsense. So you can find them on all of their multiple podcast channels, as well as now they're started putting our episodes up on YouTube. So that's been cool. All right. Well, that's it for the episode. Again, Adam, thanks for being on. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Michael, keep getting gains.
Yes, sir.
So we'll talk to y'all next time. Have a good one.
See you, everyone.